Royal Drama Story Part 1, the morning of Prince William's coronation ceremony, dawned bright and clear over London. Thousands of people lined the streets, waving flags and cheering as they waited for the historic moment. Inside Buckingham Palace, the royal family was preparing for what should have been the most important day in recent wit. British history. Queen Camilla sat in her private chambers. Adjusting her elaborate crown one final time, the heavy jewels felt cold against her forehead, but today they felt heavier than usual. Something was bothering her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. The palace staff bustled around her, making final preparations for the ceremony that would officially make William the new King of England. Down the hall, Prince William stood before a full-length mirror, his ceremonial robes draped perfectly across his shoulders. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him more than any crown ever could. He had trained for this moment his entire life, yet now that it was here, he felt uncertain about the path ahead. His wife Catherine stood beside him, offering words of encouragement and support. The television crews had been setting up for days. Cameras were positioned at every angle to capture every moment of the historic ceremony. Millions of viewers around the world would be watching as the crown was placed on William's head. The BBC's royal correspondent had been preparing her commentary for weeks, studying every detail of royal protocol to ensure nothing was missed, but something unexpected was brewing behind the scenes. Palace insiders had noticed tension in recent weeks between different members of the royal family. There were whispered conversations in corridors and worried glances exchanged during family meetings. The source of this tension seemed to center around Queen Camilla and her role in the new reign. As the morning progressed, guests began arriving at Westminster Abbey. Foreign dignitaries, government officials, and members of the nobility took their assigned seats. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Everyone knew they were about to witness history in the making. The ceremony had been planned down to the smallest detail, every moment choreographed to perfection. However, in the hours leading up to the ceremony, palace security had received several concerning reports. There were rumors of potential disruptions and unauthorized activities within the royal household. The head of security briefed his team multiple times, emphasizing the importance of maintaining order during such a significant event. Queen Camilla seemed increasingly agitated as the time approached. Staff members noticed she was making unusual requests and asking strange questions about the ceremony proceedings. She appeared to be particularly concerned about her seating arrangement and the order of events. When asked about her behavior, she dismissed the concerns and insisted everything was fine. The television production team was busy in their control room, coordinating multiple camera feeds and preparing for their live broadcast. They had backup plans for every possible scenario, but no one could have predicted what was about to unfold. The director reviewed the shot list one more time, ensuring that every important moment would be captured for posterity. Prince William took a deep breath and looked out the palace window at the crowds gathering below. He thought about his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, and how she would have handled this moment. The responsibility of leading the nation felt overwhelming, but he was determined to honor the legacy that had been passed down to him. As the royal family prepared to depart for Westminster Abbey, an unusual energy filled the palace. Staff members whispered among themselves about strange behavior they had witnessed, but no one wanted to speak up directly. The day that should have been filled with joy and celebration was tinged with an undercurrent of uncertainty, an apprehension that no one could quite explain. Royal Drama Story Part 2. The royal procession made its way through the streets of London in a spectacular display of pageantry. Horse-drawn carriages carried the family members to Westminster Abbey, while crowds cheered and cameras captured every moment. Queen Camilla rode in the second carriage, her face stern and focused. It's quite different from the warm smiles she usually displayed during public events. Inside Westminster Abbey, the atmosphere was electric. 2,000 guests had gathered to witness the historic coronation. The ancient stones of the abbey seemed to hold the weight of centuries of royal tradition. Gold and crimson decorations adorned every surface, creating a magnificent backdrop for the ceremony that would crown England's new king. The BBC's live television coverage had begun hours earlier. with commentators providing detailed background, information about the royal family, and the significance of the coronation ceremony. Millions of viewers around the world were tuning in to watch the historic event unfold. The production team in the control room monitored multiple camera angles. Ensuring that every significant moment was captured perfectly, Prince William entered the abbey with dignity and grace, acknowledging the assembled guests with subtle nods. His ceremonial robes trailed behind him as he walked down the long aisle toward the altar, where the Archbishop of Canterbury waited. The weight of tradition and expectation was visible on his face, but he carried himself with the composure expected of a future king. Queen Camilla took her designated seat among the royal family members, but something seemed different about her demeanor. Palace staff noticed she kept checking her watch and looking around the abbey with unusual intensity. Her normally composed expression showed signs of agitation that were uncharacteristic for someone so experienced with royal ceremonies. The ceremony began with traditional hymns and prayers, each element carefully chosen to reflect the sacred nature of the coronation. The Archbishop of Canterbury spoke about the responsibilities of kingship and the divine nature of the monarch's role in British society. The ancient words echoed through the abbey, connecting this moment to countless coronations that had taken place over the centuries. As the ceremony progressed, television viewers around the world watched in fascination. The BBC commentators provided expert analysis of each ritual, explaining the historical significance of the crown jewels, the ceremonial sword, and the other ancient symbols of royal power. The cameras captured every detail, from the intricate embroidery on William's robes to the expressions on the faces of the assembled guests. But in the control room, something unusual was happening. The director noticed that one of their camera operators was focusing repeatedly on Queen Camilla, who appeared to be having some kind of animated discussion with a palace aide. Her gestures seemed more forceful than appropriate for such a solemn occasion, and there was visible tension in her posture. The moment for the actual crowning approached, and the atmosphere in the abbey became even more charged with anticipation. Prince William knelt before the altar as the Archbishop prepared to place the heavy St. Edward's crown upon his head. This was the moment that millions of people around the world had been waiting to see, the culmination of months of preparation and centuries of tradition. However, just as the Archbishop lifted the crown, a commotion began to stir in the section where the royal family was seated. Queen Camilla appeared to be engaged in an increasingly heated conversation with someone near her seat. Her voice, while still controlled, was becoming audible enough that nearby guests were beginning to notice and turn their heads in her direction. Palace security personnel, trained to handle any disruption with discretion, began moving quietly toward the royal section. They had been briefed on various potential scenarios, but this was not something they had specifically prepared for. The head of security spoke quietly into his radio, alerting his team to the developing situation while trying to maintain the dignity of the ceremony. The television cameras, following their predetermined shots, continued to focus on Prince William and the coronation ceremony itself. However, the experienced camera operators began to notice the subtle movements of security personnel and the increasingly visible tension in the royal section. The director faced a difficult decision about whether to acknowledge what was happening or to maintain focus on the official ceremony. The sacred moment arrived as the Archbishop of Canterbury gently placed St. Edward's crown upon Prince William's head. The abbey fell silent except for the soft rustle of ceremonial robes and the distant sound of crowds cheering outside. This was the moment that officially transformed William into King William V, marking the beginning of a new era for the British monarchy. But the solemnity of the moment was suddenly interrupted by a sharp voice cutting through the reverent silence. Queen Camilla had risen from her seat and was now speaking loudly enough for several rows of guests to hear clearly. Her words, while still somewhat controlled, carried an edge of anger and frustration that was completely inappropriate for the sacred ceremony taking place. Palace security immediately recognized the severity of the situation. The head of security, a veteran with decades of experience protecting the royal family, had never encountered anything quite like this during such a significant ceremony. He quickly coordinated with his team through nearly invisible hand signals, preparing to handle the disruption with maximum discretion while maintaining the dignity of the coronation, the newly crowned King William, feeling the weight of the crown upon his head, sensed the disturbance behind him, but maintained his composure with remarkable discipline. His training in royal protocol had prepared him for unexpected situations, but nothing could have prepared him for this particular moment. His jaw tightened slightly, the only visible sign of his awareness of the chaos erupting among his family members. Television viewers around the world began to notice that something unusual was happening. While the main cameras continued to follow the planned coverage of the coronation ceremony, subtle movements in the background caught the attention of sharp-eyed viewers. Social media platforms began buzzing with questions about what was happening in the royal section of the abbey. Queen Camilla's voice grew louder as she continued her unexpected outburst. She appeared to be directing her comments toward someone specific, though it wasn't clear from her position exactly who was the target of her anger. Her usually perfect composure, cultivated through years of royal training, seemed to have completely abandoned her in this crucial moment. The Archbishop of Canterbury, a man with extensive experience in managing both religious ceremonies and royal protocol, continued with the coronation service while subtly acknowledging the disruption with concerned glances. His years of training allowed him to maintain the sacred nature of the ceremony even as chaos threatened to overwhelm the proceedings. Other members of the royal family sat frozen in their seats, unsure of how to respond to such an unprecedented situation. Princess Catherine looked particularly distressed, her face showing a mixture of embarrassment and concern. The younger members of the royal family appeared confused and frightened by the unexpected turn of events during what should have been a celebration. Palace. Aides moved swiftly but quietly through the abbey, trying to assess the situation and determine the best course of action. They faced an impossible choice between maintaining the dignity of the coronation ceremony and addressing the growing disruption that Queen Camilla was creating. Their training had covered many scenarios, but nothing quite like this. In the television control room, the director faced mounting pressure from multiple sources. Viewers were calling in with questions. Social media was exploding with speculation. His own camera operators were requesting guidance about whether to capture what was clearly becoming a major incident. The decision about how to handle the coverage would have lasting implications. For both the broadcast and the royal family, Queen Camilla's behavior became increasingly erratic as palace security approached her position. Rather than calming down as might have been expected, she seemed to become more agitated by their presence. Her voice carried across the abbey as she made statements that were completely inappropriate for the sacred setting and the significance of the moment. The international dignitaries and government officials in attendance watched in stunned silence as the situation unfolded. Many of them had traveled thousands of miles to witness this historic coronation, only to find themselves witnesses to what was rapidly becoming a royal scandal of unprecedented proportions. Security personnel finally reached Queen Camilla's position and began speaking with her in low, urgent tones. However, their attempts at discretion were undermined by her continued loud responses and increasingly animated gestures. It became clear to everyone in the immediate vicinity that this was not simply a minor misunderstanding that could be resolved quietly. The situation reached a critical point when Queen Camilla stood up completely and began gesturing wildly while speaking in a voice that could now be heard throughout much of Westminster Abbey. Her words, though still somewhat restrained by years of royal training, carried clear overtones of anger and frustration that were completely inappropriate for the sacred coronation ceremony. Palace security made the difficult decision that the disruption could no longer be ignored or managed discreetly. The head of security approached Queen Camilla directly, speaking to her in low, urgent tones while gesturing toward the exit. The conversation was clearly not going as planned. As her responses became even more animated and her voice grew louder, King William, still standing at the altar with the crown heavy upon his head, finally turned slightly to acknowledge what was happening behind him. The expression on his face showed a mixture of disbelief, embarrassment, and determination to complete the ceremony, despite the chaos erupting among his family members. The newly crowned monarch faced his first major crisis. Within minutes of taking the throne, the Archbishop of Canterbury made a subtle decision to accelerate certain portions of the ceremony, attempting to bring the coronation to a dignified conclusion before the situation could deteriorate further. His experience with both religious services and royal protocol proved invaluable as he navigated this unprecedented challenge while maintaining the sacred nature of the proceedings. Television cameras, following direction from the increasingly frantic production team, tried to maintain focus on the official ceremony. While the control room erupted in urgent discussions about how to handle the coverage, the BBC commentators, initially unaware of the full scope of what was happening, began receiving urgent messages through their earpieces about the developing situation. Queen Camilla's behavior reached a point where palace security could no longer handle the situation discreetly. 2 security officers flanked her position while speaking urgently about the need to remove her from the abbey. Her responses were clearly audible to nearby guests, who sat in shocked silence as they witnessed this unprecedented breach of royal protocol. The international media. Representatives in attendance began to realize that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple coronation ceremony. Photographers and camera operators started subtly adjusting their positions to capture what was clearly becoming a major news story. Though they were still constrained by the strict protocols governing coverage of royal events, Princess Catherine looked absolutely mortified as she watched the situation unfold. Her training in royal behavior had prepared her for many challenging situations, but nothing like this. She appeared to be trying to signal to other family members about how to respond, but everyone seemed frozen by the unprecedented nature of what was happening. The decision was finally made by the head of palace security that Queen Camilla needed to be escorted from Westminster Abbey immediately. The disruption had gone on far too long and was threatening to completely overshadow the coronation of the new king. Security personnel moved into position to facilitate her removal, while trying to maintain as much dignity as possible. As the security team approached her more directly, Queen Camilla's reaction became even more dramatic. She appeared to resist their suggestions and continued making statements that were clearly audible to a large portion of the Abbey's congregation. The situation had moved far beyond anything that could be considered a minor disruption or misunderstanding. The newly crowned king, William, made eye contact with the head of palace security and gave a barely perceptible nod, apparently authorizing whatever action was necessary to restore order to his coronation ceremony. This moment would later be analyzed extensively by royal watchers as the first major decision of his reign. Made under the most challenging possible circumstances, the Archbishop of Canterbury continued with the final portions of the coronation ceremony, his voice remaining steady and dignified despite the chaos surrounding the royal family section. His ability to maintain the sacred atmosphere while such unprecedented events unfolded demonstrated remarkable composure and professional skill. Social media platforms around the world began exploding with speculation and commentary as viewers shared their observations about the unusual events they were witnessing. During the live television coverage, hashtags related to the coronation began trending for reasons no one had anticipated. As millions of people tried to understand what they were seeing, the moment that would define the entire coronation ceremony arrived when palace security finally made the decision to physically escort Queen Camilla from Westminster Abbey. 2 experienced security officers approached her position with professional courtesy but unmistakable authority, making it clear that her departure was no longer optional, but absolutely necessary for the attenuation of the ceremony. Queen Camilla's reaction to this intervention was swift and dramatic. Rather than accepting the situation with the grace expected of a royal family member, she appeared to resist their guidance and continued making statements that echoed throughout the ancient abbey. Her voice carried clearly to the international dignitaries, government officials, and distinguished guests who sat in stunned silence. The television cameras, initially focused exclusively on the coronation ceremony itself, could no longer ignore what was happening. The BBC production team made the difficult decision to acknowledge the disruption while trying to maintain the dignity of their coverage. Commentators struggled to find appropriate words to describe what millions of viewers around the world were witnessing: King William, bearing the weight of both the crown and this unprecedented crisis, demonstrated remarkable composure as he watched his stepmother being led away from his coronation. The expression on his face showed the weight of his new responsibilities, as he was forced to make difficult decisions about his own family within minutes of becoming monarch. The escort process was handled with as much dignity as possible under the circumstances, but Queen Camilla's continued resistance made discretion impossible. Security personnel maintained their professional demeanor while firmly guiding her toward the abbey's exits, their training evident in how they managed such a delicate and unprecedented situation. Other members of the royal family remained seated in obvious shock and discomfort. Princess Catherine appeared particularly distressed, her face showing a mixture of embarrassment and concern for both her husband and the monarchy itself. The younger royals looked confused and frightened by events that were completely outside their experience of royal protocol. International media representatives realized they were witnessing history, though not the kind anyone had expected. The carefully planned coronation coverage was being overshadowed by events that would likely be discussed and analyzed for decades to come. Photographers and camera operators worked within their constraints to document what was clearly becoming a defining moment. The Archbishop of Canterbury, drawing upon decades of experience with both religious ceremonies and royal protocol, made the decision to continue with the coronation service despite the disruption. His steady voice and dignified presence helped maintain some semblance of the sacred atmosphere that the ceremony required. Even as chaos erupted around the royal family, as Queen Camilla was escorted through the abbey toward the exits, her voice continued to carry throughout the sacred space. The content of her statements, while not entirely clear to all observers, was obviously inappropriate for the setting and the significance of the moment. The contrast between her behavior and the solemnity of the coronation was striking and disturbing. Palace staff and security personnel worked quickly to minimize the impact of the disruption on the remainder of the ceremony. They coordinated through subtle signals and brief conversations to ensure that the coronation could be completed with as much dignity as possible. Despite the unprecedented interruption that had occurred, the international television audience, numbering in the hundreds of millions, watched in fascination and disbelief as events unfolded. Social media platforms were overwhelmed with commentary and speculation as viewers tried to process what they were witnessing during what should have been a celebration of royal tradition and continuity. The escort of Queen Camilla from Westminster Abbey was finally completed as she was led through the massive doors and out of the sacred space. The relief among the remaining congregation was palpable, though the damage to the ceremony's dignity and the royal family's reputation was already done. The silence that followed her departure was heavy with tension and uncertainty. King William, now alone at the altar, without the family member who had caused such disruption, seemed to find new strength and determination. The completion of his coronation ceremony took on added significance as he demonstrated his ability to lead during crisis and maintain the dignity of the monarchy even under the most challenging circumstances. The coronation ceremony concluded in a much more subdued atmosphere than anyone had anticipated. King William completed the ancient rituals with dignity and grace, but the joy and celebration that should have marked this historic moment had been overshadowed by the unprecedented events that had just unfolded. The newly crowned monarch faced his subjects and the world with the weight of both the crown and a family crisis upon his shoulders. As the congregation filed out of Westminster Abbey, the conversations were hushed and filled with disbelief about what they had witnessed. International dignitaries, who had traveled thousands of miles to attend this historic coronation, found themselves instead witnesses to what would likely become one of the most discussed royal scandals in modern history. The carefully planned celebration had become something entirely different. Outside the abbey, Queen Camilla was escorted to a waiting vehicle by palace security personnel. Her departure from the coronation site was swift and discreet. But the damage to the day's proceedings and the royal family's reputation was already irreversible. Media representatives who had gathered to cover the celebratory procession found themselves instead documenting a royal crisis. The BBC's coverage attempted to maintain dignity while acknowledging the unprecedented events that had occurred. Commentators struggled to provide context for what viewers had witnessed, as there was simply no precedent in modern royal history for such a disruption during a coronation ceremony. The production team faced the challenge of balancing journalistic responsibility with respect for the monarchy inside Buckingham Palace. Emergency meetings were already being convened to address the crisis and plan the royal family's response. Palace staff worked frantically to develop statements and strategies for managing what was clearly going to be a major public relations disaster. The celebration that should have followed the coronation was quickly cancelled as the focus shifted to damage control. King William's first hours as monarch were spent not in celebration but in crisis management. The weight of leadership that he had trained for his entire life became immediately apparent as he faced decisions about his own family while trying to maintain the dignity and stability of the monarchy. His composure during the crisis had demonstrated his readiness for the throne, but at a tremendous personal cost. Princess Catherine stood by her husband's side. As they navigated this unprecedented situation together, her support and steady presence became crucial as the new royal couple faced their first major challenge as king and queen consort. The partnership that would define their reign was tested immediately under the most difficult possible circumstances. The international media response was immediate and intense. News organizations around the world led with the story of Queen Camilla's dramatic escort from the coronation ceremony. The carefully planned positive coverage of the new king's coronation was replaced by analysis and speculation about the incident and its epicenters. Implications for the monarchies. Future social media platforms were overwhelmed with discussion about the events. Video clips and photographs from the ceremony were shared millions of times as people around the world tried to understand what they had witnessed. The hashtags related to the coronation trended for very different reasons than palace planners had anticipated. Within hours of the ceremony's conclusion, palace officials released a brief statement acknowledging that Queen Camilla had been removed from the coronation due to a health issue. Though few observers believed this explanation given what they had witnessed, the challenge of managing public perception while protecting family privacy became immediately apparent. The royal family's immediate future became uncertain in ways that no one had anticipated. King William's reign began with a crisis that would likely define public perception for years to come. The stability and dignity that the monarchy represented had been shaken by events that seemed impossible to explain or justify. In the days that followed, the story continued to dominate international news coverage. Royal experts and commentators analyzed every aspect of what had occurred, trying to understand the implications for the monarchy and the royal family. The coronation that should have been remembered as a celebration became instead a symbol of family dysfunction and institutional vulnerability. The long-term consequences of the disruption remained unclear, but the immediate impact was undeniable. King William's reign had begun under a cloud of controversy and family conflict that would require careful navigation and skilled leadership to overcome. The new monarch faced challenges that no amount of royal training could have prepared him for. Testing his character and resolve from his very first day on the throne,